I wonder if you've ever played sport with somebody who's just a cut above the rest. Somebody who is just obviously better than those around them. I think of a time playing rugby of a guy who, his name was Luke. He was a fantastic player, a brilliant player. Not only was he good at a kind of local level, a school level, or a county level, he played England schoolboys, and he was phenomenally good then. Not only that, he was part of the golden generation. Kind of shows how old I am. He played alongside Johnny Wilkinson, the kind of generation that won the World Cup in 2003. And not only did he play alongside them, but at the time he was the star among the superstars. He was the star. But you've never heard of him. You've never heard of him. You see, something happened to Luke. He was the best among his peers. He was the best among the stars. And yet something clicked. Something changed. Suddenly he started to slow down into contact. For those of you who don't play rugby, you just don't do that. Suddenly he missed tackles. He was nervous about tackling people. What used to be a safe pair of hands became a pair of hands that dropped the ball regularly. And in the course of a year, he went from playing England schoolboys to being on the bench of our school second team. A huge drop from grace. So much potential, so much ability, so much physical ability, and yet nothing really came of it. End of that year, end of that season, he stopped playing altogether. He gave up. Why? Fear. Fear. Fear of what other people would think, fear of failing, fear of losing, fear of his dad. Fear is what stopped him reaching his full potential. One social commentator says this: the greatest story anyone can tell is the story of their life. Just don't let the climax of your story be unrealized dreams. Now, perhaps Luke's story is a familiar story for you. Maybe not in your sporting career, but perhaps as a Christian. Perhaps in your Christian life. Perhaps when you became a Christian, you were full of passion and bowled over with the goodness of the gospel that you would boldly tell people, even if they rejected you. But perhaps that fear creeps into your life and has creeped in after a couple of months or a couple of years. Now you perhaps do just enough to tick the boxes, to give the perspective, the viewpoint to other Christians that you're out there living the life, but you're scared. There was an American evangelist called D.L. Moody. He lived a couple hundred years ago. Changed the face of his nation in America. And he puts it down to one conversation he had with a fella. This fellow was an Englishman called Henry Varley. They had a conversation in 1873. D.L. Moody can only remember one sentence from the conversation. One thing that this fella said that inspired him for the rest of his life. Henry turned to D.L. Moody, who was only 18 at the time, and said to him this: Moody, the world has yet to see what God will do with a man fully dedicated to him. The world is yet to see what God will do with a man fully dedicated to him. Here's the intention of this week. Here's the reason why we're here. Here's the reason why we're delving into 2 Corinthians tonight. Why you've travelled across the country. Why we exist as an organisation. Our intention is that God would generate in you an intense risk-taking for the gospel, so that your team, your clubmates, are stunned by the greater glory of Jesus. That's what we long for. That's why we're here. That's what we want to see happen. We don't want to see ourselves included living lives that tick boxes, that are full of potential that's just unrealized because we don't trust God and see Jesus clearly. We don't want to see good Christians doing the right thing safely within the realms of their security. We want to see bold risk takers in a generation that doesn't like our King stepping out and telling them the truth about who he really is. Why do we need this risky action? Why is it so important? Well, just look at the culture we live in. We know perhaps 10,000 Christians in the world of sport in the UK. Sounds a lot, doesn't it? That's one Christian to every 2,000 non-Christians in the world of sport. Put that as an unreached people group alongside nations around the world, we'd be in the top 3 for sports culture. Sports culture would be in the top 3 in the UK for unreached people groups if you measured it against other statistics. You live in sport in your university, where very few people see Jesus for who he really is. You live in a generation where social statistics will say that Christianity is on the decline. Churches are closing rather than opening. They're becoming gyms and bars rather than places of worship. You will be fed ideas left, right and centre that will tell you that it's just not plausible. The Bible is historical and not true. Great at a time, but we've moved on. You'll be faced with these things on a daily basis in your lecture halls, in your sports teams, in your conversations with your mates. And it's really easy to listen, isn't it? It's really easy to fall into that kind of slow creep where you start to say nothing, where once perhaps you'd have been bold, even very bold. You see, the passage we have before us tonight looks complicated. It's very simple. The clearer you see, the bolder you become. The clearer you see who God is, who his son Jesus is, the bolder you will become. As simple as that. And that's our challenge tonight, is to start this time together seeing Jesus clearly and realizing that when we see him, gosh, we want to go. We want to run that race. We want to tell people the great news of who Jesus is. Look at sentence 10 and 12. It says this: "For what was glorious," past tense, "has no glory now in comparison with that surpassing glory," that greater glory of Jesus. Verse 12, "Therefore, since we have such a hope, we are very bold. For what was glorious has no glory now in comparison with the greater glory." Here's what's going on. Verses 7 through to 12 basically tell us that we can now see much clearer than ever before. We can see crystal clearly who God is because Jesus has now come. You see, in the Old Testament, the way that they saw the glory of God was through Moses, through the law given to Moses. When he was given the law, he was on a mountain and he was in the presence of God, and the glory of God shone from his face when he came down the mountain. So much so that he had to wear a veil over his face because it was blinding for those around him. Moses kept the veil on as the glory faded because he was embarrassed that the glory was fading. And so in the Old Testament, how did you understand, how did you conceive the glory of what God is like, or is through what he gave to Moses, the law? That's how you saw the glory of who God is. Moses was the dead cert on the team sheet as you looked for the greater glory of God. And yet, the glory of God displayed through what Moses gave the people pales compared to the greater glory displayed in Jesus Christ. And that's what Paul wants us to see. Here he is in the Corinthian church being battered by false apostles. People are saying, hey, look, surely we should just follow what we heard from Moses, the Torah, the Old Testament. That's how we really get to know God. That's how we really will see God clearly. And he's like, no, don't be deceived. Jesus shows us an indescribable glory of God. And when you see him clearly, boldly you'll go. He is so much more magnificent, so much better. Verse 8, have a look at it. You see, Jesus is God's new way, and he is far more glorious. First time at the end of sentence 8, it says this: Will not the ministry of the Spirit, Jesus brings the Spirit, be even more glorious? He's comparing something Moses did, being God's mouthpiece, telling the Israelites about God's glory, what he is like and how to live for him. And then he is saying, no, Jesus is God. You want to know what God is like? Look at Jesus. God himself come in human form to show us what he is like. But not only that, Moses gave them the law. He gave them the law which shows them like a mirror their rejection of God, their need for forgiveness, their need for reconciliation. Jesus makes that reconciliation possible. Through his death, his resurrection, we are saved. We are reconciled, sons and daughters of the living God. That is who you are if you believe in Jesus Christ. You are a son and daughter of the living God. What Jesus has done is indescribably glorious. And we want our sports friends to be stunned by the greater glory of Jesus. Perhaps your friends look through a veil. Pretty thick one, no doubt. They can't really see who he is at all. Blind to who he is, perhaps see him as a historical figure, a crutch, a waste of time, nothing more than that. Yet you see him clearly. If you put your faith in Jesus Christ, you see the Son of God himself, the glorious one, the servant king, the one who loves you enough to die for you. That's who we want him to see, isn't it? Wouldn't it be fantastic if every sports person on the planet had the opportunity to see Jesus clearly? Isn't that worth living for? Isn't that worth taking a risk for? Isn't that worth jumping out of bed for a prayer meeting early in the morning on a rainy day at your university? Isn't it worth pushing down those butterflies when you are about to ask a mate to come and hear about who he is? Jesus Christ, the greater glory. Verse 9 tells us that he is much more glorious in how he makes us right with God. We see the law doesn't make us right with God, it shows us our sin. We cannot, through our performance, make ourselves right with God. We can't do it. We fail 24/7. Yet Jesus makes us right with God. His death in our place makes us right with God. When God looks at you, he sees Jesus' record, not yours. Now, you may have heard that numerous times. You may have sat in church, in CU, in CIS, and heard that dozens of times. And it can begin to wash over you. The magnitude of what that means. The magnificence of what God has done. The awe of his love for you and the lengths he went to make you right with him. I wonder if you perhaps feel a little bit condemned tonight. Last term sucked. Didn't go particularly well. Not sure if people really knew how last term went for me, they would call me a Christian. Is it right that I sit in this room amongst these people? It's hard, isn't it? First term at uni, second year at uni, third year at uni can be really tough. Perhaps it was a great term and Christmas kind of went, oh great, I've had a good term, just take a pause. Jesus, you can sit over there for a bit, I'm just going to rest and be with the family. Even though Christmas is all about you, I'm just going to take a pause for a couple of weeks, get my breath back. I'm sure I'll start again soon. Easy to do, we've all done it. Well, tonight is an opportunity to refocus. To focus again on the greater glory of Jesus, to be stunned by him. Why? Because it makes us bold. Very bold. And that's what we need in this generation. Not passive partakers, but bold risk takers for the gospel. And you see, Jesus' glory is even more glorious than Moses, and it's a lasting glory. It doesn't fade. It doesn't fade. Look at verse 11. It is much more glorious. And if what was fading away came with glory, how much more great is the glory that will last? You see God clearly if you believe in Jesus Christ. And it will last for an eternity. You will see him more clearly and more clearly and more clearly, and you'll be face to face with him in eternity, forever. Isn't that fantastic? The glory you have in Jesus, the understanding of God you have in Jesus will last forever. Forever. This life zips by. It disappears. Rosie was very kind to me earlier. She said Greg was at Edinburgh University a few years ago. When I was at Edinburgh University, most of you weren't born. So it wasn't a few years ago, it was your lifetime. Feels like yesterday. Still remember it. Still remember the challenges of being in my team, sharing Jesus with my teammates in my university in Edinburgh. Yet the group leaders that lead the group now were just a twinkle the day I led the group at Edinburgh. Life zips by. Yet we will last forever. Not because you deserve it, not because of your merit, not because you've earned it, but because of the greater glory of Jesus and what he has done for you. It is so glorious what he has done. You will last forever. Now why does it matter? Or if it's been a difficult term or a challenging Christmas, or if it's been a good one. We want you guys to leave here stunned with the greater glory of Jesus and willing to do whatever it takes so that others can see him too. Whatever it takes. You don't need to follow a pattern or a formula, or Christians in sport formula that is easy. Whatever it takes so that those around you can see Jesus for who he really is. I was in London a while ago, and I was early. I like being early. I was early for a meeting, and I kind of stood in the place on the pavement where I was meeting this chap. And I was a bit bored. Didn't really know what to do with myself. I watched and read BBC Sport quite a few times that day and knew what the headlines were. So I kind of just stood there and looked around, old buildings everywhere, and there was this huge clock on one of the buildings, a really old clock in one of the buildings in front of me, and I was looking at it, and it had a Latin inscription around the clock, and I remember doing Latin at school. I think I could work out what one word was, but that was about it. But my sister speaks Latin. It's a little bit of an odd thing to be able to do, but she can. She studied classics at Oxford and then went and translated the Pope's speeches into Latin for him in the Vatican. That was her gap year. I went to Australia, she went to Rome, but there we go. And so I thought I'd just drop her a text. So I took a photo of the clock and sent just a question mark. She knows me pretty well, she knew what I meant. And I got a quite surprising text back. It just said this: don't just stand there, redeem the time. I kind of looked around thinking, she's definitely not here. How does she know I'm just standing here? Don't just stand there, redeem the time. Then I clocked it. Obviously, that was a translation of the Latin around the clock face. Don't just stand there, redeem the time. You've got one time at university. Some of you have got 1 year left. You may have one season left. You don't know if you're going to get injured or what. Redeem the time. Because what you have in Jesus is the greatest thing ever. And we want people to be stunned with the greater glory of who he is. The clearer you see, the bolder you become. And verse 12 tells us his glory, well, it leads to our guts, doesn't it? His glory leads to our guts. Therefore, since we have such a hope, we are very bold. When we grasp who he is and the glory he have in him and how much better that is than what they had, we can be very bold. Very bold indeed. Remember the intention at the beginning. That this couple of days, this few hours you have together in this centre, as generations have had before you, our intention is that it would generate in you an intense risk-taking for the gospel. An intense risk-taking for the gospel. What does that look like? I was on a train on the way into London. It wasn't the same day as the clock, but similar. On the train on the way in, early morning, loads of emails to do, things to type up. Like everybody else, just trying to get my head down, full of commuters on the train. I'm sat there in a bank of four towards the end of the carriage, and to my horror, a cheesy Christian came onto the carriage at the far end and started to talk to the different people and hand out pamphlets. I was gutted. It's kind of the kind of prayer you say, oh Lord, you know what, I've got a lot to do. I've got a lot of emails to do. Do I have to have a conversation with this fella? And this is so naff. Look at the commuters' faces. What is he doing? Oh, this evangelism technique is rubbish, Lord. In my sin, I was definitely not up for it. And as he got closer, I got even more embarrassed because he was sweating profusely and he was stuttering over his words. I just thought, what a poor advert for Jesus Christ this is. And then he got to our bank of four and he said, gents, do you mind if I have a moment for your time? Of your time? Nobody said yes or nobody said no. We just kind of stopped and looked at him, sweating profusely. And he said, I was once pretty blind, I couldn't see. And I want to give you this. And he handed us out this business card. He said, it's a chap who does laser eye surgery. And I had laser eye surgery and it's radically changed my life. Now I can see clearly. And I don't want anybody to suffer like I suffered unnecessarily. So I just wanted to tell you today, this is what it can do for your life. Please, if you know anybody or suffer yourself with poor eyesight, please check this guy out and give him a call. Maybe it could change your life. Thanks, James. I'm really sorry to bother you. And off he walked. I was pretty embarrassed at that moment for two reasons. One, because I judged him massively and got it completely wrong. He was there talking about laser eye surgery, not Jesus. But two, why on earth was I sat there? Why was I sat there when the whole train carriage perhaps didn't know who Jesus is? The whole train carriage is blind. Not physically blind, that'll pass, but blindness that lasts an eternity. And I can see the greater glory of Jesus because I've met him through the pages of Scripture. And yet I sat there doing my emails. I found that incredibly challenging. Incredibly challenging that he'd have the courage to do it, and incredibly challenging because I didn't. How? How do you get that kind of courage? To take risks for Jesus Christ, to push those butterflies to the bottom and stand up. You see Jesus clearly. Because when you see him clearly, who you are in him, what he's done for you, what you will be and where you are going, nothing else matters. Nothing else lasts. It's worth it, isn't it? As we move on towards verses 13 to 18, we're going to see how there are two reasons why Jesus, being the full glory of God, makes us courageous, makes us bold. If he shows us God better than Moses, does that directly lead to us being risk takers? How does that help us? We don't read the Old Testament culturally. We don't know the law. The people in our teams have no clue about the Torah, the 5 books of the Bible that Moses wrote. What on earth does it matter? Why would they care? Well, the first is that we see Jesus and we see God. What is the second? What is the second reason why we can be so bold and very bold as we see God through Jesus clearly? Well, let's have a look at the summary in verses 15 and 16 and then move on in verse 17 and 18. Even to this day when Moses is read, a veil covers their hearts. They can't really see God perfectly. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, that veil is taken away. That could mean your mates. That could mean you. That was once you, veiled to who God is, and now you can see clearly. Let's take a moment just to think about what that looks like in your setting. Have you ever heard It's a classic Christian or non-Christian illustration of the elephant. You know, and people say, oh, all religions are the same. I say, oh, it's just three blind men and an elephant. And one guy's holding the tail, one's holding the trunk, and one's touching his foot. And they all have a different experience of what the elephant is like. None of them are wrong because they're all the same thing. You've ever heard that kind of pluralist statement? It's a classic one that gets thrown out at university. Oh, all religions are the same. And it seems like really quite plausible. We all have this longing for a higher being, and your understanding of that might be different to mine, but that's okay. It's all a load of rubbish. Why? Because in Jesus we see the glory of God himself. Only through Jesus do you really see who God is. And Paul wants them and he wants us to be in absolutely no doubt about that. To be confident in that. Because in the melting pot that university is, you're going to be fed all kinds of ideas, all kinds of theories and philosophies on what life is about, the purpose of life and how it fits together. And it's going to be tempting. But when you look at Jesus, who he is, what he's done, what that means for you and where you're going, that is all you need. And that is all that matters. Because he is the true revelation of God himself. The clearer you see, the bolder you become. But not only that, we're courageous. We can be bold, not just because we see God more clearly through Jesus, but because we can now see ourselves more clearly too. Let's have a read of 17 and 18. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. We can see what we're going to become through this passage. That not only does he, through his Son, make us right with himself, whatever term we've had, however sinful we think we are saved through Jesus Christ, and his account is our account. But not only that, he is transforming us. He is making us more like himself with ever increasing glory through his Spirit. That's who you are. You're someone that God hasn't left alone. You're someone that God loves, has adopted into his family, and is transforming with ever increasing glory. We are unveiled. We see God through his Son Jesus, and he is transforming you to be more like Jesus. That is what he is doing, not what you're doing. That is what he is doing. And as we choose to look at him and learn and understand, the Spirit works in our lives and makes us more like him. And we reflect his glory to the world around us. Mark, telling the story of his running club. His running mates get to see the greater glory of Jesus as Jesus transforms his life. As he boldly proclaims who Jesus is. That's who you are. As you see yourself clearly, as you accept who you are, you begin to walk in it. My sister, same one, I've got two, she, in another gap year, decided to go to Portugal. She's a bit of a freak. No, it wasn't Portugal. She went to Brazil and they speak Portuguese. There you go. That's the Portugal link. And she was there for 6 months. It was way before the time of emails and things like that. And so there was no way of knowing what was going on. And she came back 6 months later. We'd hardly heard from her in 6 months. And we were all there as a family waiting for her to get off the plane, desperate to see her again, find out how she was, what it was like. And she came off the plane and she walked towards mum and, she more like that, she walked towards mum and dad. And she's like, all right, mum. Now that is my really bad attempt at a Liverpudlian accent. And the whole family just kind of went, what? As you can tell, we're not from Liverpool. In fact, we're from the furthest south point in the whole of the British Isles, from Jersey. And And there's my sister. She'd only been in Brazil where they speak Portuguese, and she was now speaking Scouse. It was very, very odd. And for about a month, her whole demeanour and her accent was like she'd been bred all her life in the city of Liverpool. Very, very odd behaviour. And it took us a long time to kind of work it out. Not that Liverpudlians are odd, but odd for her. No offence to Liverpudlians. But very odd. And then we worked out why. As she began to tell the stories of her time in Brazil. You see, she was in Brazil, where they speak Portuguese, but she was living with 3 girls from Liverpool. And as she shared life with them, she began to speak like them. Without even realising it, she adopted their accent. She didn't even know she was doing it. She only realised when we all went, "Who are you?" as she walked off the plane and started to speak to us. And as you see Jesus more clearly, and as his Spirit works in your life, you become more like him. You become more Liverpudlian. You become like Jesus. And you may not even notice it happen. In fact, often the hallmark of the Spirit is you think the opposite, that you're getting worse and you're rubbish. But actually, the Spirit, like a spotlight, shines on what he's going to do next, where he's going to change you and make you more like the Son. And you are his reflection to the world around him. You reflect the glory of God. You see, you become what you focus on. You become whom you behold. The more you spend time grappling with who Jesus is in his word, the clearer you grasp who you are in him and what he has done for you, the more you become like him and reflect him to the world around you. Remember Luke, my friend from school. So much potential, yet it was unrealised. Remember D.L. Moody. The world is yet to see what God will do with one man's life dedicated to him fully. Your life is ahead of you. Your term is ahead of you. Your sports team are in front of you. You know Jesus. You're his. He's transforming you. Throw aside the fear. Be fearless. Look at the greater glory of Jesus. Don't look at your sin. He's paid for that on the cross. Look at the Son and who he is. Don't look at your weaknesses, but look at his power and what he can do even through you. Don't give in to your fear, but become a risk taker for the gospel. We desperately, desperately need people like that in this generation. Who knows? 40 years' time, when they say, oh, there's been Christians in the world of sport for 80 years, not 40 years. What the state of our nation will be like, what the state of sport will be like. But I pray that it'll be full of risk takers for the gospel. That being in the world of sport will be synonymous with hearing about Jesus because there's Christians everywhere boldly telling people about him. That there isn't a club on campus that doesn't have a Christian as part of it. That every single place you go, whatever team you sign up for, whatever age you are and whatever country you live in, there's Christians telling people about Jesus Christ and living it out boldly. That's worth living for, isn't it? That's worth getting up out of bed for in the morning. Let's take a moment. Just close your eyes, pause for a little bit. Don't think about what was, think about who he is. Jesus is the Son of God, King of Kings, the most magnificent. He clearly shows you God's glory. Loves you enough to die for you. You're an adopted son and daughter of the King. That is who you are. He is transforming you into his likeness. And your role is to boldly tell a generation that is veiled to his identity who he is. Biggest battle we face is believing it. Let's pray. Father, you are magnificent. You are glorious beyond our comprehension, and yet you have revealed yourself to us in the greater glory of Jesus Christ. Thank you for who he is. Thank you for his death for us, for his resurrection, our hope of lasting life, everlasting glory with you. Thank you that your Spirit is amongst us. Lord, we put aside our terms, our Christmases, we turn to you again. Lord, generate in us such a yearning for people to see you that we are very bold, that we become a fearless people in our cricket teams, in our athletics clubs, in our footy, our hockey, whatever sport we play, Lord. Lord, may we use this one life you've given us and make it count. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's stand and sing.